Hello and welcome to On Leading with Greatness. I'm Jim Salvucci. This week's installment, the hard truth about why leadership advice fails many managers. Every time you make a bad choice, it becomes harder to make a good one. Rick Warren. Great leadership advice is everywhere, yet so many managers still suck. Spend a few moments on LinkedIn or other business platforms and you're bound to run into someone like me, a self-declared leadership expert. Of course, I have leadership certificates and all, but so do many others. I'd like to think I have something special, a certain je ne sais quoi that sets me apart. I'll leave that for others to judge. With all this leadership advice, most of it quality, cluttering social media, our bookcase shelves, and our Audible lists, you'd think that we'd see a profound and widespread positive shift in how people in general manage. I guess things have gotten a bit better in spots, but overall the same assumptions and practices, the same bossing ethos that have always held sway remain set. Most people in positions of authority cling to mere bossdom. I'm sure this fact has a bit to do with the leftover bad bosses who have yet to retire or be run out by their long-suffering victims. But my sense is that even newly forged managers are more likely not to be so minty fresh as we might hope. One of the more crucial conceits of my leadership philosophy is that leaders beget leaders, that if great leaders model and teach best practices and ideal behaviors, they will leave a legacy of other great leaders. This argument even constitutes the conclusion of my book, Greater Than Great. As I watch people I used to supervise and closely mentor climb the ranks years after I left their lives, though, I see the limitations of my theory. Many former mentees manifest the sorts of leadership behaviors I promoted, but others just want to lazily default to the familiar and crappy ways of the boss. Frankly, it's a choice. They know better, but better just seems too hard. They are up for certain challenges, but only technical ones, the sort that can be solved via research, calculation, and hard work. They aren't up for the honest challenge of leading every day, of crafting their characters so that their behaviors will inspire others to do their best, and of getting people to do what needs to be done because they want to do it. In other words, it's just too hard for them to do the right thing and not boss. And I suspect they know it, and it makes them miserable, which makes them cranky, which makes them misbehave, which undermines their team members, fosters dysfunction, and lowers overall productivity. Nonetheless, they choose to be a lousy boss because it's easier in the here and now. Tomorrow be damned. Often they make this choice because circumstances have changed. It's one thing to be on a team whose leaders give everyone the space and means to both act autonomously and collaborate. It's another to find yourself working for a boss who micromanages, bullies, or neglects. Would it be too glib for me to say that if you have to compromise what you know to be right, aka your values, to work for a certain boss, don't work for that boss? I've been there, in middle management, stuck with bosses whose practices and demands were entirely counter to everything I knew to be right. I've also worked to provide security to my teams to operate in a more productive manner in that environment, and I've seen others do the same. Some of the people now ambling down the boss lane have themselves benefited from that space I created. I've also left the scene when I realized I could no longer resist the pressure from my toxic bosses. My only options became to start crushing my team members on behalf of my overlords, get crushed myself, or stand idly by while my people got crushed. I opted for the fourth way and skedaddled. Let me give a more positive example. When I became a VP, I had a direct report, an executive manager who had an exceedingly difficult job. She had to oversee branch offices spread across a massive territory. Each branch office had its own freestanding management structure that had to meet identical critical standards. This executive was responsible for assuring those standards were met. No one had ever really trained her to do this or any management job, but her instincts and values were solid. Still, the logistics alone would wither a weaker person. Worse still, as middle management, she found herself constantly pushed and pulled at the same time. When I entered the picture, she was beleaguered, and the whole structure was cracking under the strain, as was she. With my encouragement, she leaned more into her values and her considerable skills as a communicator. Soon we were back on track. What she learned without me needing to spell it out was that the autonomy combined with guidance I offered her to handle the situation was precisely the formula she needed to apply to the lower managers who reported to her. Smart. Since she was a resilient person of integrity, this approach suited her. When she moved on elsewhere to become a vice president herself, she ended up working for a CEO who was a micromanaging bully. Again, she leaned into her values, creating a protected space for her team to operate productively. When the situation became untenable and her efforts futile, she simply resigned, much as I had before. In other words, she made uncomfortable choices to remain a person of integrity. You could argue that by leaving, she exposed her team to the toxic CEO, but that was going to happen anyway. As in my situation, the oppressive CEO was an unstoppable force. My former colleague instead chose to preserve her values and not participate. Too many others I have seen fool themselves that they are the only person who can stand up in the toxicity, even long after they've become contaminated by it. They incrementally, almost imperceptibly, transform from solving the problem to becoming the problem. I'm not suggesting that the choice to do the right thing is a cakewalk. Quite the opposite. It takes tenacity and guts. In contrast, choosing to abandon your leadership practice and transform into a boss due to the immediate circumstances surrounding you is incredibly easy, although you might struggle to sleep at night for a bit. In the end, I just can't tell you how much it breaks my heart to see some of my long-ago mentees do just that. Abandon their principles and succumb to the easy choice of becoming a boss. I've also noticed a marked increase in their arrogance and self-centeredness, which is to be expected. As I've written before, research shows that power causes this sort of brain damage, suppressing our ability to empathize. Doesn't it explain so much of what's wrong in this world? That's why great leaders must actively work to preserve their empathy and to use it to benefit their team and their organization. Bosses don't. The choice is really that stark. Do you behave as a boss or a leader? Advice on making that choice is easy to come by. After all, I offer it all the time. Once you've made the choice, though, depending on which direction you choose, that's when the hard work begins. That's when you need to consult the experts who can help guide you through the inevitable challenges. It's not impossible, just hard. But always remember, the harder the challenge, the more satisfying the reward. How well do you follow valid leadership advice? Why do you think so many managers choose not to? Making hard choices and taking challenging advice is vital to great leadership, and I can help. Unlock the great leader within. Download my free resource, the Transform to Greatness Toolkit, now at thegreatleadershiptoolkit.com. And don't forget my book, Greater Than Great, available on Amazon. I look forward to hearing from you.